As I promised, here's my second video about the new Canon announcements from the last weeks. It's about the Canon R1, which I was able to try out for a day at the event in Munich, just like the R5 Mark II. However, it didn't impress me nearly as much as the R5 Mark II. So, if you want to know what I think about the R1 so far, stay tuned. I'm David, you are watching The Vision, and let's go. If you find that you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell, and feel free to check out my Instagram as well. The R1 has been a huge topic for years. Do you remember the rumor that the R3 was supposed to be an R1, but then the Sony Alpha 1 came out, and Canon decided not to call it R1 to leave more room for improvement. So yeah, I don't know how much truth is in there, but the R1 doesn't really feel like much has changed in the last 2.5 years since the R3 was announced. And it doesn't look like much has changed either. Maybe that's more like an R3 Mark II? However, the camera has indeed become a whole lot bigger and weighs another 100 grams more. Still, it feels good and solid in the hand, but handles quite differently from the R3. And also the golf ball texture on the grip material is also gone. The R1 sticks with the familiar LPE19 battery from the R3 and from the 1DX models. So existing batteries can continue to be used from users that switch to the new camera. What I also wished for the R5 Mark II from the R3 was this little smart controller on the backside, which is a pleasant alternative to using the joystick for moving focus points. The R1 has it, but the R5 II unfortunately not. Price-wise, the R1 is expected to be around 7,500 euros or $6,300, which is 1,500 euros more here in Europe than the R3's introductory price. And it is supposed to be shipping starting November, but the clear date is not out yet. The cameras we had in our hands were very early firmware versions 0.4.0 and were of course pre-production models. Some people at the Canon event also had issues with the camera crashing. But let's get to the essentials of this camera. Unfortunately, the somewhat disappointing part of the R1, the sensor. There were indeed a lot of rumors about the R1 beforehand, and I was so disappointed that none of these rumors were true. The R1 neither has more resolution than the R3, 30 megapixel was rumored, nor does it have a dual gain output sensor similar to the C70 that might give us 16-bit RAW files, which would have been awesome. Nor does it have a global shutter sensor like Sony's Alpha 9 Mark III. So the question is, what does it have? It has a faster 24 megapixel backside illuminated and stacked sensor. Such a sensor was also in the R3, but now in the R1 it's faster. The jump from 30 raw images per second to 40 raw images per second is not particularly impressive to me, especially when you look at Sony and what the Alpha 9 Mark III can do, and that the Alpha 1 did 30 FPS with 50 megapixel years ago. You also have to clearly say that a global shutter sensor has its drawbacks, yes. But given the expectations and the hype created around the R1, this is simply too little innovation for me at first glance. Especially the ability to flash at all shutter speeds would be something that would be interesting for Canon shooters as well, and no light flickering at all, never, would also be quite nice. At least there are significantly faster flash sync times here. 1/320th of a second in EFCS mode and 1/400th of a second in electronic shutter mode, which is at least something new. It also shows that the sensor is quite fast, but it should be when you consider what Canon has packed into the R5 Mark II, and this here seems to be a bit too little for the R1, in my opinion. And what the R1 cannot do better than the R3 is shutter speeds, but it's not bad here. It has a minimal 1/64,000th of a second. That's achievable with the R3 and with the R1 as well. This is very impressive. As far as I know, there are no limitations on the lenses that can handle this short exposure times with Canon, unlike with Sony. What Canon particularly emphasizes about the R1 sensor are two things: the new cross-type autofocus. You might remember it from DSLR times, when there were normal autofocus points and then more precise cross-type autofocus points for better precision in focusing. And one always tried to use one of these cross-type sensors, you know, the chimping and so on and so forth. Mirrorless cameras have so far only had normal autofocus points, but with contrast detection also. This can, for example, result in different autofocus accuracy between horizontal and vertical shots. Now the R1 does the following. 1 of every 4 autofocus pixels is rotated 90 degrees to realize cross-type AF. Is this much better? In theory, yes, but in practice I have no idea, because I never have noticed a problem when shooting in vertical formats compared to landscape formats. But I heard from people that some cameras might have trouble with these situations. The second important new innovation of the R1 is a new low-pass filter with 16-point separation instead of 4-point separation, which Canon claims is extremely expensive of a component in that camera. And that should reduce moire effects just as well as before, but achieve a better sharpness of the sensor, just like without any low-pass filter. And of course, the new sensor should be much faster than the one in the R3, as can be seen from the burst rates or the flash sync times, but also in terms of rolling shutter. A lot has been done here. Definitely, I didn't see any distortion from rolling shutter artifacts with electronic shutter at 40 FPS, even when basketball players flying directly towards me. I can totally understand why the R1 does not get 30 or more megapixel for the target audience of the camera, which is journalists in sports or documentary styles. It's hardly necessary in these cases, but I'm still disappointed that there isn't anything much else noteworthy here. In terms of continuous shooting, the R1 could shoot at 40 FPS full resolution RAW for 4.5 seconds. That equals to 180 shots and about 6.5 gigabytes of buffer space. And also very interesting about the R1 is the included pre-shooting here. The camera can take up to 20 images before fully pressing the shutter at a half-pressed state. That's important, so you cannot miss the right moment, like for example with wildlife or with sports. I used this extensively in the basketball test that Canon provided us, and I was filling the 128 GB card Canon provided with the camera very quickly. Luckily, I had some other cards with me as well. Because the burst rate of the new camera can be set much more finely, you can now use the pre-shooting for almost 5 seconds at a lower frame rate like 5 FPS rate, or 0.5 seconds at the maximum 40 FPS rate. This is quite cool, as mentioned, but it fills up the storage incredibly quickly. And yes, what I want to emphasize here again, pre-shooting is no longer stored in a separate container, which you need to use with the annoying Canon DPP software to extract the files. Ask me how I almost went crazy trying to export these files here from the container via DPP in Madeira. Oh my goodness. The R1 also features the new IBIS system, which in collaboration with a stabilized lens is supposed to provide 8.5 stops of compensation for shake, just like the R5, and it works as well here. Also now the new CPA standard allows for measuring the center and the outer image, and this is 7.5 stops here in this test provided. Unfortunately, I cannot yet open RAW images from the R1. I shot everything in Canon RAW and JPEG, and maybe it will be possible eventually in the future. Canon also states that they focused on a good noise performance with this camera. That's very important for like indoor sports. When you want a fast shutter speed, then you have to bump up your ISO if your lens is not fast enough. So let's take a closer look at the JPEG images from the camera. Natively, the R1 offers ISO 100 to 2400, which is one of the reasons why a global shutter isn't always automatically better. The A9 III can't offer this, nor can it achieve the same noise performance at the same sensor resolution. Unlike the R5 Mark II, I wouldn't hesitate to use ISO 50,000 on the R1. Yes, it's a bit grainy, but absolutely usable and pleasantly grainy without any annoying color noise. The ISO 100,000 step here looks very similar to what you get from the R5 Mark II with ISO 50,000, but it's still usable with some limitations. Yes, folks, ISO 100,000 is more or less usable here with a stacked sensor. What the fuck? And this is not a 12 megapixel sensor like the A7S III, but it's a 24 megapixel stacked sensor. And so that's very impressive. I'm curious to see what dynamic range this sensor brings, especially since that has always been a topic with stacked sensors. Feel free to write in the comments if I should take a closer look at the R1 when it eventually hits the market in November. The R1 also includes the upscaling and denoising AI capabilities that I discussed in the R5 Mark II video. Check out this other video if you're interested in more details in these techniques. And the other big new feature of the R1 is, of course, the autofocus, like in the R5 Mark II. I talked about this in the previous video. It's now called Dual Pixel Intelligent AF, and it is intelligent AF. It's so intelligent because in addition to the new Digic X, there's a Digic Accelerator coprocessor. It's also built in through the camera, and it's the clear division of tasks between the two processors. Much better recognition and tracking speeds can be achieved in this way. What puzzled me a bit about the R1 was the absence of automatic subject detection in the AF modes. But this makes a lot of sense in the professional context through. I didn't photograph portraits or breakdancing with the R1, only basketball. And for this with the new action priority mode, and this is quite impressive. Players moving past the zone with the ball are tracked again as soon as they reappear behind another player when they have the ball. Other cameras would have jumped to a different player in the meantime that's closer to the camera. Moreover, the autofocus, when it works, is incredibly sticky to the eyes, to the heads. It remains extremely well attached to the subject being tracked. And you can see significant advantages in action priority compared to before. Sometimes I couldn't even believe that the camera tracked that good. However, the system still has its weaknesses. For example, when two players are very close together, such as when one is defending, it often can't distinguish who has the ball and who's the subject in the frame. Since the camera is still a pre-production model, there's still a lot of time to improve this. Up to this point, the autofocus has been extremely impressive. It seems, like I said, it's intelligent AF. Get it? Canon's new autofocus has greatly convinced me, and in my opinion, it's now a bit ahead of Sony's autofocus again, especially due to the excellent tracking in the action priority mode, which no other manufacturer offers in this way. So it's made more or less for sports, and that's, like I said, the target audience for this camera. The R3 was also quite good at video, and the R1 is not so different. Unfortunately, yeah, it's really not so different in any aspect, except that it includes a few cool features from the R5 Mark II, but not all of them. What I missed most was that the R1 doesn't have the waveform display, which I find hard to understand, but we are talking about Canon here, so you know. It does include, in fact, the custom picture functions, like including Canon Log 2, Canon's 709 color look, and of course RAW video. However, due to the 24 megapixel sensor, it only offers 6K RAW up to 60 FPS, which is more than sufficient. Yes, and since it's just 6K downsampling, the R1 can also record 4K 60 FPS oversampled from the entire sensor. My whole R5 II B-roll, for example, and almost everything I shot with the R1 was shot in this 4K 60 downsampled mode. And one feature Canon heavily promotes, which I didn't mention in the R5 Mark II video because I didn't find it practical, is the ability to take photos and videos simultaneously. It's a joke for me. It's an extra mode that can only record Full HD video and JPEG photos. So no filming normally while taking photos and no taking photos normally while filming. So what's the point? The point is, this mode is for taking evidence when you need to supply evidence for a photo, how it has been taken. So that's what it is for, and nothing else, nothing more. Regarding overheating, nothing was said about the R1, but I suspect that the large body provides much more space for heat dissipation. And 6K doesn't generate the same heat as 8K, so I think it's fine here. It was also nice to see the improved video stabilizer, which I already discussed in my R5 Mark II video. It's also in the R1 and it works quite well. Unlike the R3, the R1 uses two CF Express Type B card slots, so you won't be speed limited when recording redundantly to both cards for security reasons. Compared to the R5 Mark II, the R1 adds only one more port, and it's a network port, which is crucial for journalists to upload images directly from the camera to an FTP server. This network port now also offers 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, which combined with the new multi-threaded FTP technology is pretty cool. The camera can transfer multiple images simultaneously, not just one at a time. Additionally, it also features Wi-Fi 6E for a fast wireless connection with MIMO technology. There's even a technology in the camera that can switch between the network connections depending on which is faster, or if you unplug the cable, it continues transferring via Wi-Fi. Everything is tailored to the professional user so far. But what confused me a bit was that the display was downgraded compared to the R3. The R3 had a 4.2 million dot LCD display, twice the resolution of, for example, the R5, which I find really impressive and really liked a lot. The R1 comes now with a usual, like we know from the R5 Mark II, 2.1 million dot 3.2 inches screen. It seems to be a bit brighter outdoors, but it's not like in the R3 where you had really this crazy sharpness. The viewfinder here, however, is special. It features the best currently available viewfinder. That's the 9.4 million dot model we have seen in several Sony cameras already. Compared to the R5 Mark II, the viewfinder magnification is much better here at 0.9x. It feels a bit like looking through a cinema screen or looking through the window. The viewfinder runs at 120 Hz and can also be switched to blackout-free mode, although I didn't already had any blackout even without this mode. Additionally, it's 3 times brighter than before according to Canon, which is great because dim viewfinders in bright environments can cause a lot of eye strain and even headaches, so I definitely enjoyed using the viewfinder. But much more interesting is what you find around the viewfinder. The eye control autofocus. Like R3 and R5 Mark II, you can now move the focus points by looking at the area of the frame. When this technology works correctly and it is well calibrated, it's an impressively cool feature and a super fast, easy way to control focus. I love it when it works. Fortunately, with the R1 I had no problems calibrating it and it always worked as intended for me, unlike with the R5 Mark II. Maybe it's the bigger viewfinder openings here that help there tracking my eye, I don't know. I couldn't test the R1's battery life at all, but Canon states it now takes 1330 shots with the display and 700 with the viewfinder according to the CPAS standards. In practice, this should be easily get 2 or 3 times as much, and it will be no problem shooting a whole day with this camera, and it's a significant improvement over the R3. And when you consider it's the same sensor resolution, you see there are much added efficiency needs in this camera here. I had a lot of fun with the R1, mainly because you don't get your hands on such a camera every day. However, for me, it's only a true flagship due to its massive size. Yes, I like the handling, even if it's not for me personally, I prefer smaller bodies. What it does very well. Yes, of course. And maybe it's exactly what Canon shooters for journalists and sports want. But compared to the competition, it's not a real flagship because it doesn't offer the best of the best. Is it enough? Yes, but it's not the best. What's the point of having a big and hefty flagship when it can be outdone by a small and quirky looking fishing boat? Canon has its reasons to not include a global shutter sensor here, allowing for higher ISOs with this good performance and avoiding the drawbacks of the A9 Mark III. However, it also misses out on advantages like unrestricted flash use, like no flickering at all. Ultimately, I think Canon simply isn't ready, or the sensor is not in a state where they like to put it in this camera. They probably can not put a viable, good global shutter sensor for all needs into this camera series, wherever they want or not. So they've opted to include more of what we already know, just better, faster, more optimized, more efficiently, and call it R1. Considering that the R3 was intentionally not meant to be the flagship, I find that the R1 offers too little new things, and it was somewhat disappointing for me and likely for many others as well. It feels much more like an R3 Mark II than like an R1. If any of the rumors had been true, it would have been more understandable. A camera with like a DJO sensor, 16-bit RAWs, or at least maybe 30 megapixel in the same super fast package, would have been much less disappointing overall. But as it stands here, at least the autofocus is convincing. Yes, it's really, really good. It's intelligent AF. So, who among you is actually in the market for the R1? I'm not. Has anyone seriously considered buying this camera before? What are your thoughts on the R1? Are you also disappointed or genuinely excited for the new Canon Flagship? Feel free to write your thoughts in the comments down under the video, and under the video is also where you find links to the R1, but it probably doesn't matter as much here. But if you enjoyed this video, please leave it a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell to ensure you don't miss any of my future English videos. Here are 2 more videos you can watch next, here. And that's it for Division for today. And I will say goodbye and see you next time.